Good morning, everybody. It is with great joy that I start another debate of the Fabricadeideias 2021. I'm going to have to improvise a quick introduction of what the Factory of Ideas you already know. I'm convinced that it's one of the most exciting projects we have at Brazilian Academy. And this project has been developed since the beginning of the 90s. And it's always seeks to interpolate our contemporary world based on issues of social and racial inequalities in different national contexts. The notion of comparison of something that is fundamental, the diaspora always in touch with this international diaspora that intercommunicates. I think the Factory of Ideas is one of the most stimulating products in the realm of Brazilian universities, and it's been responsible for training uncountable number of people and colleagues. And I would like to start my session today in these debates of the Factory of Ideas 2021. And it has been profoundly impacted by the pandemics. And we have to discuss the pandemics, but also we have decided to debate to be taken by the disheartening feelings that we have here in Brazil, where we have particularly frightening times before the pandemics, the Factory of Ideas in 2019, we debated the new fascisms and authoritarian regimes in 2019. And I would state that something that has followed our debates about the situation in Brazil and in the world is the disheartening feeling, the immense sadness. Today, we have over 415 people dead. And yesterday, we had the frightening numbers that there are at least 30% of deaths that are being underreported. So easily, we have over 500,000 deaths in the Brazilian context. It's a massacre. And it could have been avoided if it did not interact with the project of the current president. So I think I would like to envis this environment, this universe that it's been touched in such brutal ways. But I think we were right when we decided to incorporate this notion of utopia in our debates. So it's fundamental that we try to look ahead. What are we going to do in terms of also honoring those who have left us in such frightening ways in this last year? And in order to compose this table, when we started to debate who was going to be a part of this select group of guests, immediately we had in mind Cristina Roldão. And I'm going to try to introduce her as an intellectual, with affection as well. And why affection? It's important to justify that I have a very close relationship to this guest and to Portugal. And the Portuguese reality interpolates my work, my life, my childhood, the transformations through which Portugal has undergone. And all of this has been a part of my research. Patrícia knows that this interpolates me in very, very visceral ways. And in the last years, one of the things that have stimulated me is that Portugal was undergoing a process of a profound transformation and necessary transformation, and a process that has subjects. We have subjects that are moving forward with this transformation process. And amongst these, we have to evince Black people, Portuguese people, migrants, Black migrants, Black former colonized people, Black people also of Brazilian origin. And amongst these colleagues, these subjects, these accomplices, I would like to thank for the presence of Cristina Roldão. I've been following your trajectory in Portugal, and I believe that Cristina has a quality, which is on one hand, the ability to listen to what we actually are not even forced to hear. However, she listens to it again and she reacts to stuff that we should no longer need to say. So she has a fundamental role in this debate in Portugal and in particularly in Europe in general. I think that the situation of Black people, migrants who have another skin complexion, what happens in Portugal follows up what happens all over Europe. So I think it touches us directly. So Cristina has a fundamental, crucial role, and I thank you for her efforts in these last years. And I'm going to have a more formal introduction. Cristina is
sequestrada pelos baianos e, portanto, nós, nesses últimos tempos, temos contado com essa presença luminosa, que é a presença de Patrícia entre nós. Ou seja, nos últimos anos eu venho trabalhando com Patrícia e posso dizer a vocês que trabalhar com Patrícia é um raro privilégio, né? E Patrícia será a nossa debatedora hoje. Bom, sem mais delongas, agora eu vou passar a palavra à minha querida Cristina Roldão, mais uma vez afirmando a nossa imensa alegria. E só uma coisa, que eu queria dizer, quando eu estava pesquisando coisas da Cristina, pensando em como falar, etc., eu encontrei uma fotografia. E é uma fotografia da Cristina abraçando a Sueli Carneiro. E essa fotografia me emocionou de uma maneira indescritível, porque Sueli Carneiro, no Brasil, nos últimos 30 anos, 35 anos, Sueli Carneiro é uma referência, é um farol, é uma luz, é uma professora, é um modelo de ação, é um modelo para a ação, é um pilar ético e político do nosso país. E ver Cristina sorrindo e abraçando Sueli Carneiro, me disse, gente, que delícia, eu quero um dia abraçar a Cristina também, porque eu já abracei a Sueli. Então, agora eu quero abraçar a Cristina também. Bem-vinda, Cristina, por favor.
Muito bom dia a toda a gente que se junta a nós nesta conversa. Depois desta apresentação do Omar, não é? A pessoa fica assim sem saber o que dizer, mas dizer apenas que é um prazer estar convosco, que é um prazer fazer parte destes debates onde a gente vai ligando e religando o Atlântico Negro e refletindo sobre racismo e sobre pandemia em Portugal, no Brasil e noutros contextos. E eu quero, antes de mais, agradecer a equipa que organizou esta 22ª edição da Escola Doutoral da Fábrica de Ideias. E, claro, não posso deixar de destacar a professora Patrícia Godinho, o professor Omar, Thomaz e o professor Lívio Sansone, que há vários meses estabelecem contacto comigo, via e-mail, via WhatsApp, no sentido de me acolher da melhor forma possível para poder hoje estar convosco, preparada e focada naquilo que foi o convite que me fizeram para discutir aqui. Convidaram-me para refletir sobre a relação entre racismo e pandemia, e é sobre isso que vou tentar falar nos próximos 30 minutos. Eu vou tentar não ultrapassar os 30 minutos, a partir do olhar claro de uma académica negra envolvida na política pública em Portugal, no debate antirracista, no movimento negro. E também, claro, dizer que, em certa medida, falar sobre racismo e pandemia é, de certa forma, difícil, porque é um fenómeno que estamos a viver, e é um fenómeno extremo e de uma violência extrema, e acredito que daqui a alguns anos possamos olhar para este momento e avançar teorias e avançar conhecimento. Portanto, venho falar sobre qualquer coisa que está a acontecer, que está neste momento a acontecer, e, portanto, não quero deixar de manifestar alguma humildade da minha parte, não é? em trazer esta discussão. Portanto, não é possível esgotar o assunto, não é possível ter uma abordagem fechada numa caixinha arrumada sobre o assunto. Então, aquilo que eu vou trazer são algumas das portas de entrada, não é? Que eu tenho pensado como portas de entrada para refletir sobre a relação entre pandemia e racismo a partir do contexto português, mas sempre fazendo, quando possível, articulações com outros contextos. Antes também ainda de começar, uma palavra. Eu sei que o luto e a luta estão e eu não podia deixar de falar sobre isso e dirigir as minhas condolências a toda a gente, todos aqueles que neste momento estão a viver uma perda, e dizer-vos que se do Brasil nos chega essa imagem distópica, por outro lado também nos chega muita inspiração, e o Brasil tem sido historicamente um sítio de inspiração sobre como é que se luta.
I'm sorry, I was having problems with my connection, so I'm back. So I would like to leave here my condolences, senses, and my acknowledgement and my joy of being here and sharing my thoughts with you in such difficult times. Race and pandemics are profound categories that are intertwined because there are biological issues and political issues in the sphere of the body, but both are an outcome, and they produce relationships that structure the organization of societies from a perspective of a global capitalism. So what can we say about a colonial matrix? There's no capitalism without colonialism, and vice versa. Not in new ways, not in old ways. There is a strict or tight, close relationship in terms of these categories. They are fundamentally articulated. These pandemics are an outcome of wild capitalism on a global scale. It's a racialized capitalism because from the standpoint of conducting an affirmation of an assertion, a spread of that follows old practices of with beings that are subaltern in this capitalized world. And what are the interests of labs that are supported by the richest countries conducting the privatization of these vaccines? So we have geopolitical games between the North and the South, and we realize that humanitarian help is going to place the South vis-a-vis the North, the global North. And what are we watching now in terms of this humanitarian support? On the other hand, in light of the gravity of these pandemics and the national choices, neoliberal choices about how the state should work and the universal rights in living, in education, etc., about work relationships, labor relationships. In part, what we see in this pandemics has to do with the failure of the state and the capturing of the states by neoliberal logic. There's not many states that are not only fulfilling, no longer fulfilling, and it's been an opportunity for the market. Private hospitals, they are supported, transferring to companies and hospitals that produce everything of something that should be public and university. The pandemics or the ways that it has been handled is a symbol of the necropolitan system, politics that decide who can live and who can die. As Carolina Jesus has stated, in the Quarto de Despejo, we know that on one hand, the body that are dignified for social protection and the bodies that are disposable, the cheaper meat or flesh in the market. What leads us to global issues in an extreme phase of the genocide of the Black population? This relationship between racism and death is an essential element. Enslavement implied in social death of the enslaved subject. It's his or her deshumanization, legitimating the banalization of violence upon Black bodies, taking as subhuman flesh. Ruth Gilmer, a geographer, defines racism as exactly the production and the exploitation sanctioned by the state or the extra-legal work in terms of the differences of premature death of a group. Racism then places us in this axis of the precipitation of death. So when we look at issues in the census in 2001, in refusing to see that Portugal has multiple groups, that it's necessary to have public policies that provide an answer to the problem, and that it's a pillar of our democracy, racism. But in the states where it exists, in Brazil, in the United States, and in Canada, it systematically confirms that non-white people are more vulnerable to the impacts of the pandemics. The precipitation of death by COVID, what establishes then the cares and the conditions for prevention for the virus, like confinement, or issues of hygiene. Also the poor work conditions, the precarity of work conditions, the exposure to risk. What occurs to me is that when we had the emergency decree, we had posters stating stay home, but the poor impoverished population could not stay home. The communication means were talking about the cleaning of all surfaces and what were the bodies that were destined to this work. And these were going to be impoverished Black women working in cleaning, in hospital, in office spaces. Women historically have been the ones who look afterwards. It's a work that is devalued, extremely devalued, and stigmatize those who take the risk of looking after others. We know that gender violence has increased during the pandemics, and we know that even before the pandemics, women were more subject to feminicide, and therefore we need to think about the moment in which people intersectionality then presents its most violent face, gender violence and racialized violence. On the other hand, those who thought about there was an employment of police brutality. The state of exception was already an issue prior, but now it has become even more explicit. And it has then meant that racialized territories, not only this increase, this has to do with an hygienist approach that deals with us in terms of the risk of contagion, but also because the contact with this community, except for when it's cleansing the spaces, the bodies, and the surfaces that might be exposed to the pandemics, while there were Black neighborhoods that were patrolled by drones and police cars. The factories that revealed COVID outbreaks did not have the same repressive treatment. Through a type of telescola has increased social differences from families that had internet at home for computers and the capacity to support families without computers and with no capacity to look after their children while they were at home. And of course, in terms of the racialized communities, in terms of ethnic differences in Portugal, I don't want to share these ideas that we should not try to contain the spread of the virus. But we have issues such as the negationism and racism is systemic, and the pandemics, it needs to have a racial lens to be analyzed. Of course, not everything is the same, but it allows us to see the depth and the structural character of racism. The relationship between racism and pandemics is also visible in terms of the political and scientific narratives have been contributing to a racialization of the pandemics since the beginning. And this has been normalized in mediatic discourses. We need to think about how there has been stereotypes about food eating habits by the Chinese, who eat several wild animals, for example, the exotic other. We need to remember of how there were rumors that the COVID has been created in a lab by Chinese scientists. But the final result is in that several countries in the United States, United Kingdom, and Portugal, there's evidence that racism and xenophobia against Asian people have increased significantly. When it comes to the discourses about the Black population, I'm going to evince two events. The first was in 2020 when we had a Parisian in the National Institute of Research and Medical Research were on TV raising the possibility of testing this vaccine in the African continent. In this perspective, fundamentally colonial about the African continent has raised intense reactions in terms of racism, and it's draw international attention, classifying it as racist and neo-colonialist, and that in Africa will not be a field test or a test field. So in social media, there is the myth of the immunity of Black bodies. Jair Bolsonaro mentioned that Brazilians needed to be studied because it is possible that nothing's gonna happen, and that most bodies were going to be immunized. The myth of immunity, issues regarding security in the Black community. This is profoundly racist, and it feeds into colonial tropes. The notion that bodies have been strengthened and that would naturally develop more antibodies. And it's impressive by how this myth has been spread. And we know from statistic standpoint, we are going to be the ones paying for the weight of this. And the other way in which we have the responsible people who recreate discourses about cohesion, national cohesion. And above all, we have the Portuguese president who's been important in terms of pushing forth the notion of Gilberto Freire, that Portuguese have a special capacity for miscegenation. Of course, I know that you know what I'm addressing here. In Portugal, we have our version of the same myth. But then the president described the Portuguese as people who have 900 years of history. We are talking about who are the Portuguese. In this description, do we have gypsies, Black men and women? Who have been feeding into what? He also states that the Portuguese will survive the pandemics while others will succumb. This notion of superiority. We also have the discourses of André Ventura, a leader of the right-wing party, in which he states that 3 deputies are elected, 3 Black women. in Fernandes by the Socialist Party, all from Ghana. And André Ventura stated that he prepares a proposal in which African communities should be imposed upon a more strict curfew rules. We know that what's new here is that what they are proposing, it creates a space of normalization of this type of discriminative approach. The notion that we could have specific confinement for ethnic minority in Portugal, and it has become part of the issues to be approached as though it's possible to reflect upon such proposals. And then those who are defending freedom of expression stated that along the history of resistance of Black people, the majority of ways we haven't been able to free ourselves from those who have oppressed us. Finally, confinement and social distancing have contributed to a territorialization of interactions, and interactions have been then virtual through social media and circumstances of daily life. The right wing have been utilizing in order to manipulate a large number of people, bomb them with racist discourses. So these are some entry doors. I'm moving towards my conclusion. But in order to wrap up this communication, I would like to evince how exactly in this context we've been experiencing, against all probabilities, Black political mobilization on a global scale. And it's been exactly during the pandemics had the Black Lives Movement gaining an international approach, international evidence, international reach in interrogating our current social order. And issues such as institutional racism, we are no longer talking about issues of tolerance. We are talking about structural racism. We are talking about whiteness. We are talking about privilege. We are talking about coloniality. We are no longer reducing it to people who are morally weak. It is a result of a colonial racist history and also of police brutality. In Portugal, we've had protests fostered by George Floyd's assassination, denouncing local cases of police brutality. We had police violence in the Decoche family and several other instances that I could describe to you later. We had then people in the downtown area in the Freedom Village. They were manifesting and protesting rather, and they were crushed and kicked out of downtown by the police. We also had a strong moment in which we had the creation of channels and spaces in which we always debate issues of the presence of the Portuguese colonies, of the colonized, rather, transferring to the virtual world issues of debating, organizing political organization of the Black movement in Portugal. These Black communities have become more organized in spite of the difficulties, in the sense of creating a sense of solidarity and care for children, and also mobilization. If at this moment, it is difficult times, mean that we are going to have a strengthening of more just and sustainable ways, or if we are going to be completely swollen by the advancement of this predatory capitalism. We may not predict, but we know that it's more of the same. The struggle does not end, even when we are in mourning. Thank you. Extraordinary, Cristina. Thank you so much. I think that this capacity to expose such an impressive situation for us and that touches us profoundly. I'm going to now invite Patrícia, who is our debater today. Thank you, Patrícia. So can you hear me? Good morning to all. I would like to start by thanking profoundly my colleagues in the Factory of Ideas for inviting me to be the debater of this session. It's an honor for me to be here, and particularly to debate with a colleague that I respect very much, which is Cristina Roldão. She's already been introduced. So she is someone who's been developing some very important work, not only about Portugal, but it extrapolates all to other contexts in which everything in terms of Afro descendants in Portugal and the Brazilian world, as she has stated. I thank very much my elderly Professor Omar Thomaz, who's a great friend of mine, who is a great researcher, who knows Africa very well and who's seen me since I was very young in Guinea-Bissau. I've been learning a lot with Professor Omar, and I believe that his words, the words that he has initially brought here, shared with us, are indeed related to this complex international scenario that is provoked by the pandemics and the new coronavirus. And I would like to join Cristina when I state that I leave you here my salutations, my condolences for those who have lost their loved ones, and to all Brazilians who are struggling during this tragic moment. As my reflections are going to be in the sense of establishing a dialogue with Cristina, at the same time touching upon some subjects that she has made clear to us, a dialogue. Why? Because Cristina finds herself in a country, in a European country, in Portugal, and therefore she is an Afro-descendant, and it's necessary to make that clear. And at the same time, she is Portuguese herself, and though not exactly that is my condition, but I am from Guinea-Bissau. This circularity between my country and Portugal and Italy and Brazil that has adopted me. I also have this, I would say, identity of being an African woman who has also lived a large portion of her life in the diaspora, in the more contemporary meaning of this word. And what I'm going to state here has to do with some issues that I see from Italy, being located in a space which is the Mediterranean area, that has also been one of the centers from which we have these problematics linked to Africans who try to get into Italy. So we have this migratory waves to the space. There's also the tragic aspect of those who end up at the bottom of the ocean. I believe that the first general consideration, taking into consideration what Cristina has shared, has to do with the need to revisit and debate as central elements in the identity formation processes of the Portuguese, but also something that in Italy also takes place. I think that the racial issue is once again as part of the center of the public debate, a theme that has destabilized level civil interactions in several countries. And here in Italy, this is a problem that for many years have been underestimated, and your potential then in terms of the fractures that therefore there's been for many years the illusion that the explanation of building a multicultural, multi-ethnic society has already been acquired. So then that notion of lusotropicalism that was already in multicultural, but the impression is then to talk about the Italians have then turned a blind eye to this generalized tendency about values that were non-negotiable. And for example, in this case, in Italy, those who cannot remember that we have our colleague who is Italian and Brazilian, can't you remember what the Congolese Minister Cecile Kiange had to endure in 2013? Now that we have in terms of the quality of our contemporary democracies, I am able to read it in terms of the issues that have a repercussion in terms of health, in a moment of crisis such as this one, emerges for me an issue in terms of community that seems to be an important word. But what is this community? From what values do we need to rethink and restore this community on a global level? So when Cristina brings these issues of those who come from below, because civil society and the developments of social groups, we have then at the same time all the inequalities that emerge from of a positioning that is more and more drastic in terms of powers, and therefore on a situation there's always more complex in terms of the decisions and positionings from governments. And what is the sense of this word community? What does that really mean? On the other hand, I think that racism, institutional racism, from which Cristina Roldão is talking about, takes us back to a need of looking back in time. There are manifestations of this racism for a long time. Let's talk about France in the 17th century, in which Louis XIV regulated, or Louis XIV regulated racism. The lives of those who were enslaved in French colonies, and the institutionalization denial of human beings in 1904. Let's shed light on the genocides that have been more obfuscated, which is the Herero Povo, people on Alleluia. But it's a massacre that's never. And then we had the genocide on behalf of race purity of Jewish that has found its justification in Gobineau's racist theories. So that invites us to think in terms of this explanation by Professor Cristina, this type of looking back in history or retrospective. And a second dimension is that throughout Europe, we have been watching an intensification of racism. The pandemics have created new scenarios in terms of inequalities, which has been evinced by Cristina Roldão, but also in these two lectures, in opening lectures on last Tuesday, by Professor Maurício Barreto and Professor Jorge Ticata. And that happens within these migrant categories. These differences, these inequalities, in parallel, we don't know the true groups, as been referred by Cristina, of the economic impact of the pandemics in more vulnerable groups. And therefore, we are dealing with phenomena that is on the rise and that is in full development. So we need then to think about these pandemics, what creates then problems in terms of studies that may be organized and made clear in one of these conferences, opening conferences, but also that leads us to a need to be cautious in terms of the reflections that we seek to present. Another problem that seems to be an issue in the pandemics has racism, and the pandemics and xenophobia is creating is this global entity or nature of the problem, be on a political level, and the resurgence in African countries, for example, the use of violence in order to impose the norms of social distancing, like in Rwanda, Guinea-Conakry, Mozambique, and among others. And for example, in South Africa, there's been building a wall vis-a-vis Zimbabwe in order to protect those who are infected by the virus. This is part of a text that's been made available for reading here for our students or our participants by Professor George Chikata, and bringing and translating behaviors that are clearly xenophobic. And therefore, this is not only happening, and the notion that's not necessarily linked to issues of the pandemics, but the notion of Donald Trump of building a wall that should be separating Mexico from the United States. But in this case, we also now see this issue within the context of the pandemics in the African continent, supposedly to contain immigrants coming from Zimbabwe. I don't know how much time I have. In the same ways, we also have the emergence of xenophobic reactions and racist reactions in European countries. In the 2000s, it have been one of the most complicated in terms of political discourses and narratives, in terms of behaviors. And then Cristina has made it clear that I would like to bring here some considerations about that. And there's been many of these Italians, amongst the most famous ones, the Republic, for example, and denouncing, and a matter saying that in 2020, the attitudes towards this issue, for example, reopening, then talking about the Jewish ovens for Jewish, for homosexuals, for Blacks and communists. An opening in a swastika, and then for those so that who are listening to us, of much crude lexicon. In Italian, we state, for example, frott, to address homosexuals. So these are very heavy words and very disrespectful words. During the first phase of the pandemics, there's been a transversal increase of xenophobic and gender violence, and that have been reported by the Observatory for the Safety Against Discriminatory Acts in Italy. We have demonstrated that a significant portion of the Italians, when they are confronted with issues about what are the major problems on international levels, they respond immigration, but the perception changes dramatically when the same is addressed in terms of what kind of weight do you have on a daily basis. The weight is irrelevant or very low in the daily lives of individual Italians. This behavior, therefore, demonstrates that the problem of immigration is more national than local. It's more of a political narrative than a social problem per se. It is a problem that is denounced by the media, in which, however, immigrants become passive, and therefore talking about the fact that all of the people who look after these issues and looking at care for the elderly, and we need to think about the fact that Italy has a large number of elderly people. I'm thinking about immigrants of Philippine origin here who work fundamentally in this sector, but in this type of narrative is completely forgotten. When we are talking about these immigrants, they don't have importance. The Italian citizens talk about immigration as a problem in the system, but there's no rights for these immigrants. So in order to overcome stereotypes, it's necessary to place in the center of mediatic narratives their voice, their history, recognizing others as someone, as a human being, and as a category. So this is an important issue. This seems to be a possibility in order to rethink the relationships and overcome feelings of hatred and xenophobia that have prevailed throughout Europe, and particularly here in Italy. And finally, in conclusion, in terms of my reflection, based on some issues that have been brought by Roldão, I think we impose the need to have a change in terms of our lexicon of the words that are utilized in this sense, and that has to do with this issue of racism and xenophobia. For example, when we read here in Italy, when we had some newspaper titles that were related to this issue that Cristina has presented, this issue in the text that she has made available, we have above all titles or words such as extra community, people who do not belong to the community, to the European community, that should not only be Africans, but for example, the North Americans are extra community. But there is Italians, very rarely North Americans are not described as extra community. So these are loaded vocabulary carrying a lot of negativity in this respect. Words such as vou comprar, that has, for those who are of African origin, that has to do with also with this stigmatization of Blacks who work in this country, and not necessarily in terms, then there's several types of words that have entered a mode of expression in a lexicon that determines and demonstrates this racism, not only a racism that seems to be institutional racism, but also a racism that is that demonstrates the need to revisit the relationships, not only in terms of internal of the community, society, Italian society, but also in terms of how Italian society looks at its past, which is a colonial past, but unfortunately, it's not conveniently and well debated in terms of society, Italian society, and it seems to be an aspect that is subjacent in what has been posed by Cristina Roldão and the text that she has made available in terms of the heritage, the colonial legacy. It's a problem indeed in order to debate in less complex ways the problems with racism. And in conclusion, I would like to state that I would like to bring an invitation in so that we can start our conversation. So if all the issues that have been presented by Cristina Roldão about the problems of the pandemics have brought up naturally, and that perhaps that we are addressing issues, old problems that Portuguese have in terms of its colonies and in this contemporary Italy, and I believe that many other realities throughout Europe. An issue in particular has been citizenship and how it is linked to this issue of the possibility of vote and the issue of vote for Afro-descendant people. And that has to do with the issue of the law of nationality. Cristina has shared with us an event that seems should be evinced, in which 3 Afro-descended deputies, all of them who are present in the Portuguese parliament, and I think that's an important signal. But I wonder for how long this type of signal, how does this type of signal really bring new light or shed new light in confronting this racism that permeates Portuguese society, though we also see this lexicon change, words like blacks and Afro-descendants, and a body of words that are part of this debate, and that 15 years ago was not a part of the lexicon, and these issues were not debated. And I believe that we have a challenge, and a big challenge, which is this is the issue in Portugal, in which there may be other developments in terms of an inclusion of this population in political processes in Portugal. And there, perhaps this might be also an example, a positive example for other European countries. And perhaps that should be one of the many issues that are placed here. And Cristina's lecture then leads us to think about that. And there are other issues that I'm going to leave it up now to the public to debate these aspects that have been raised, and I am open to questions and comments. Thank you. Thank you so much, Patricia. I think that the combination of this conversation really excites me. So Cristina, then I would like you to respond, and I'm waiting for questions here. I would like to comment on something that seems to be important. I'm going to use my prerogative here as someone who coordinates this table. First, it's exceptional everything you're presenting here. I have a film, an old film that our students probably haven't watched, but people like Livio Sansoni, who are older, who are close to my age range, which is Mephisto, an 80s film, early 80s film. And we have an actor who is fascinated by the Nazi notions, and he has a black lover who he loved, and then when he realizes that the Nazi, so that he's seduced by success and other elements, but he suggests that she has to vanish, she has to leave. You need to leave, you need to go back to your country. But I'm German, but you have to go back to where you lived. And she states, go to France then. It is a striking scene. It's a 1983 film, and that brings, there's this strategy in this notion of having Europe and white Europe, and then you deny the sense of belonging of those who do not correspond to what Europe supposedly expects to it from itself. In a mirror, it's a fundamental point. And anything, if you look at European paintings, we should know that Blacks have always been there and they are here. And let me share a couple of other things with you. I was in Portugal in a seminar organized by Shana Bastos, and there was an exhibit in which Blacks in Portugal, and I have a friend, a historian. Let's go to this website. And when we came to this exhibit, then what is this? All we had to do was step out, and we realized that there was a problem. And the third point is something that was told. We had a common friend who lived for 10 years in Sweden, and he stated that he received mea culpa in Sweden, and then Richard, a Mozambican, and Rian, a white Mozambican, and they were at a store, and Mia then was addressed in Swedish, and Ricardo states, speaks in perfect Swedish, but my apologies that my friend is African and he cannot understand Swedish. And this woman was completely confused because there something was out of place. And I believe now that since we are talking about this, here's the factory of ideas, we are interpolating tragedy, but also utopia. What I see is that we have cards, and the cards are jumbled up, and we are not in a place where we should be. And I think that tragically, the pandemics has also revealed that in tragic ways, in ways that we wouldn't like this to be. The pandemics is brutal, and I think that there is a dimension that Cristina has brought. Is as though the pandemics reveals individuals that are rendered invisible. When we imagine in what ways each country has defined what was essential services and what was not essential services, we realize that the services that should be guided by bodies that were rendered invisible but these were migrant bodies. Thinking about the case of Europe and Portugal, the cashiers. In the case of Spain, those who work as cashiers, who are also African and Brazilians. We have a large number of Brazilians working in supermarkets, and also in the case of Portugal, civil construction has not stopped, and it's led by people who have to be in public transportation, being exposed to the pandemic. So this rendering invisible this immense presence and this immense visibility. But I would like to present two more comments. When I worked with colonialism, I worked with it for my whole life. There's always this characteristic of colonialism is to evince its exceptional character. The Portuguese used to state that it was different, and Italians stated that they were different. And in the end, you see that they are very similar. It is the old debate about compared enslavement, in which you have this false issue, and it's profoundly also perverse, because enslavement is a system, is a violent system, and you may find violence in different places, but it's there. And in some ways, this exceptional character of enslavement of empires is now a part of the European context in terms of European notions. Portugal is going to insist that they are exceptional when it comes to their ability to supposedly white Portuguese. They are talking about white people in dealing with Black people, with foreigners, and on those who come from other countries. Italians also state to be exceptional because they actually say that our empire was the Roman Empire way back then. And the fact here is that the colonial enterprise was beyond an enterprise of different nations. It has been that Karen Blix, there was a Danish marriage to a Swedish that had a farm in Kenya that was protected by the British colonies. So the Europeans carried this story, this colonial story or history rather, and inspired by all the issues that you have brought up, I would like to evince a word that perhaps if you were to think, a word that is very dear to Latin America, which is the word vanished. The vanished. We had military dictatorship in countries such as Brazil, Chile, Argentina, the Cone Sul countries, in which one of the practices that were carried out by repressive regimes was vanishing with or disappearing, kidnapping people who are subjected to innominable, unspeakable violence. But during the pandemics, there hasn't been people who in the pandemics are the vanished ones. And why? Because usually one of the impacts of the pandemic was exactly the possibility of mourning, something upon which we are going to have to talk about for a long time. We don't know what's going to happen. in the context of the pandemics, it's something that and all of these people who have disappeared and they do not recognize and they vanish. So there's this issue of mourning. Anton de Camp, who is one of the great anti-colonial thinkers from Suriname. So the senators' debate that we have in Brazil, Bolsonaro, in the second or third month of the pandemics, a journalist asked him about the dead, and he said, mockingly, because there is a colossal difference in terms of, he mocked and he said, what have I got to do with that? I am not, and Bolsonaro was he was lucid because he said that he's asserting a rupture, his rupture with any civilizational pact with society, and therefore this person that has been stolen from us can be brought back through a ritual in which, in a space like us, the grave digger is a key person. So what Bolsonaro said is, I have nothing to do with that. I'm not a grave digger. So we have here in this chat. I don't know if you would like to react first. So perhaps that should be what we do. I would like to thank Patrícia again for the possibility, as we have shared the issue of being Black in Portugal and debating in this reality, then we are able to establish these connections. Of course, there's no real, what we're trying to see here is how we are going to have debates about this conversation. And then I have to agree with you in terms of this need to think about, in terms of thinking about racism in current days. Not only in terms of academic circles, but from the standpoint of, for example, in Portugal, first time talking about a national plan to combat racism, referring to colonialism, Portuguese colonialism, because all of these discourses seek to evade this debate as though it doesn't have a historical background. So when we want to talk about racism, we talk about the Holocaust, we talk about the apartheid in South Africa, we talk about the colonialism, are two subjects that seem to not be presented as something that is articulated, while it is clear that it's necessary to establish this relationship. But there's a lot of resistance in effectively recognizing this historical legacy. And also, though we may consider colonial empires and this different metropolises have created justifications, and all of them have contributed to a global space for racialized people. But I need to evince Portugal had a profound relationship with trafficking enslaved bodies. The act of kidnapping and selling and dehumanizing and all of these practices of commercializing bodies. The Portuguese were key in this process. So I am not here trying to establish hierarchies, but this is a very important moment in recognizing this historical role. And another issue that Patrícia has raised in terms of reflection that is necessary. Racism is a moral issue, is an issue of democracy, is an issue of rights and power. At the same time, we may wonder if the political regime, even if it's a fragile democracy that emerges with the projects of modernity from the economic standpoint, and that initially we are able to experience the declaration of the rights of people. And then there's another discourse about Haiti, to the extent that Toussaint Louverture and others are able to acquire their autonomy, but yet the French want to maintain their dominion or their rule. And oftentimes what I wonder is to what extent it is as though racism as a legacy is an intrinsic portion. It has always been part of accommodating colonialism and democracy, and racism has always been possible to accommodate. It seems like we are, until when can we stretch this model and this issue? We have the space here for this type of reflection of a question that may be very dangerous because we don't have the safeguards within this notion of democracy. To what extent does this model then, how can it accommodate? Is it possible to maintain the pillars of what is possible, of what's being imposed upon the world? Can we accommodate truly combating racism and talk about ethnic equality? Racism is not an exception, it's a normative presence, it's part of the fabric of society. But that's an issue that when Patrícia was interpellating me, because we have three pillars. Capitalism works, operates in such a way that the North explores the South, that we have a hierarchic division of labor, and people who die then crossing the ocean, so that certain bodies cannot have access to the resources available in Europe. On the other hand, this notion of progress and technical development creates a scale of human that there are beings who are the evils and others who are superior humans, it is not very distinct from a logic of racial hierarchies and nation state. I may have a notion of a nation state and maintain this notion and also be able to establish, engage in a struggle. So the notion is who belongs, who does not belong, and this is also an issue of nationalities. And then it is impressive to see this continuity of racism. When we look at the Portuguese reality in the 15th century, we have discourses that I need to evince that have been debated in Portugal that legitimize enslavement and inferiorization of part of humanity. Enslavement, the abolition of enslavement, obviously, when we start in the 60s, we have this beginning of a categorization of individuals, and whites, of course, are rendered as civilized. Thinking about racism and the position of those who are assimilated, being Black or light-skinned Black, demonstrates that your origin of culture in order to adhere to certain ways of the Portuguese population. This position, how and how does it serve when we look at the statistics that point out to difficulties, but those who are assimilated have never been over 5% of the population is a category that exists in order to participate and to be utilized in the games of tensions of between racialized subjects, and it's like this carrot, dangling a carrot. This may be an opportunity for you. So racism in Portugal is very similar to that. For example, musicians, the Portuguese had this attraction to African musicians. Portuguese societies then have always enjoyed the musical qualities that were brought by Africans. And there are some narratives of these genres, and African music is heard in Portugal. Whites are already dancing Black music, but this is not a contemporary phenomenon, and that doesn't mean anything. So we have this statute that goes into the 60s, in which Portugal may change its perspective. This discourse is about being a multiracial country. And then the independences create a statute in terms of how to deal with their foreigners. It is as though there is a continuum of production of ornaments that are going to define who is important, who belongs, who does not belong, who is human, who's subhuman, who is at the center, who is at the periphery. And the law of nationality identity has led people for a long time that is going to have black young people born in Portugal who don't have the rights to become national citizens, and this racialized notion of bloodlines. So if someone lives in a particular country and contributes to this country, I don't like this notion of contribution, because even if you don't contribute, it should not become the search for those who are legitimate vis-a-vis others. And therefore, this is a struggle that we still engage in the sense of reducing obstacles to the extent that, from the standpoint of national identity and the tensions between different political forces, that has still is so important that even if you see from an intellectual perspective that it doesn't make sense, this is an issue. And also something I would like to debate: what does it mean to elect 3 politicians, Black women politicians, deputies? These are 3 women of racialized Black male and a minister of justice from Angola who's Black. Portugal is really a space. It's a schizophrenic space, because it is possible to have this cape of representativity without admitting racism, just debating racism. It is like is and it is not. So if we were to think about, it's a lusotropical reality context, this image of a democracy, of racial democracy, it is not necessary to talk about racism, because there's harmonious coexistence from the standpoint of the political impact. I think that we need time to see what's going to happen, but we've had Black people in the First Republic. We are going to have deputies. João de Castro, José Magalhães, 2 people who have been erased from our histories. And therefore, we are investing in what we may bring. If you would like, please check the O Negro newspaper, newspaper produced by Black students in Portugal. We had these 2 representatives, Black representatives. And the myth of a colonialism that studied I'm reading here in the comment chat section. And yet, there's been a colonialism that has been the campaigns decimating several communities in terms of the Berlin Conference. So at this particular moment, we have 2 Black deputies at a final phase of the new state do Estado Novo. We have a Black character, a woman, who is going to defend the perspectives of the new state? We have the assassination of, we are going to have the crafting of a new perspective, and we are going to have 3 deputies, one of them a woman who's racialized. We are going to have Fernando Cá, just how can I forget that name? We have Fernando Cá by PS, we have a black deputy by PCP, Portuguese Communist Party, and then Fernando de Cá is going to be replaced who are going to be a part of the assembly as the social movement referred to the protection from the part of the state and society. What these figures leave the political scenario, and there's no continuity. And what we have now is the continuity of a struggle in the international scenario. It's not a guarantee, it is an achievement in terms of space, but it's not a victory. It is important to think about what to do with the space. Assim Katamura was the head of the party, and she was then is in design being by her own party a few months after election, which demonstrates that this issue of representativeness is not really profoundly understood or taken in its full dimension. So therefore, I am happy that this has happened. I think it's an outcome of a struggle, a personal and professional struggle of these women. But I still want to see where this is going. For example, we've had the First Minister comparing the Black anti-racist movement and the strategy has been utilized in parallel. And it is an entry to these discourses. It's not as radical as people would like to think it is. Therefore, it is necessary to think. We need to understand the positive and the negative side of discourses, for example, on April 25th, by the president that was praised in the public spaces, talked about the importance of about racism in Portuguese society, but also stating, well, it is necessary to study colonial legacy, but not playing the blame game or not placing blame on any sides. It's necessary to see what is the path that we are going to choose in order to approach or analyze the meaning of these the presence of these Black women. It is true that all the countries and empires have invented these narratives about nationality ways of legitimizing colonialism, stating your colonialism vis-a-vis other colonialism, in order to have a variety of these discourses in creating these narratives, because Portugal and Lusotropicalism completely, and that reminds me the work by Grada Quilombi when she talks about the phases of migration, shame, blame, recognition, and we hope the phase of reparations. It's a psychic process that people need to extrapolate for a more vast community. So these narratives, they have a way of circulating in between denial and shame because of the knowledge. And then there's a recognition and a backtracking. Well, it's not that bad. And I need to state that oftentimes the first question that is posed to me in several events I'm invited to is there racism in Portugal? It's like being a voyeur, looking over there to look quickly and then shut down the door. So there's always this ignorance that is very a soccer player that imitate monkeys. There was a debate about whether cheering fans imitating monkey noises was racism, whether it was racism or not. So I think it's a category that is interesting because it leads us to think about enslavement and the impossibility of mourning mass death, establishing parallels with the pandemics at the moment. It's something that is strange. There's this hyper visibility. We see several faces burying the dead, these graveyards, and there's a banalization of humanity. So I think that this leads us to this notion of the vanished and how the Black bodies along the history have been systematically in this position. And then when they die, they vanish. Extraordinary, Cristina. Fantastic. Patrícia, may I talk? I would like to thank Cristina very much because she has stated several issues that I saw here, Cristina Livio has reflected on something that I'm not sure if we are going to have time our colleague is going to respond, or if it's something that I would like to pose some considerations about. And one first consideration that comes from what has been stated by Omar in terms of the word the Venice, that Cristina has reflected upon. I believe that the Mediterranean Sea has become a new space for contemporary dates in which these beds are deposited. We are you talk about enslavement and slavery and the crossing of these black bodies that have been taken and brought to Europe that crossed the Atlantic. I believe that in contemporary days they are staying in the Mediterranean, and it's something that we need to debate and reflect upon. And I think that here in Italy, it's an issue that needs to be debated or addressed. And I stated that the word the Venice that also was brought by Omar, and this impossibility of collective mourning has to do with the importance and the meaning, a larger, broader meaning when we talk about the reality of the Mediterranean. I'm living in a country that is surrounded by the Mediterranean. And therefore, I think that there's something about which we need to reflect in historical terms, in terms of the dehumanization of human beings. And I see here quickly that by the comment made by our colleague Liviu about the issue, I would state, of racism and demand by the empire in stating actually that the British did that, and that and in praising fascism by the Italian law is a crime. It's an issue of making the law effective. 1 or 2 years ago, though my son is mixed race, phenotypically speaking, Black, and at a station, a train station, I was buying the tickets, and then a police wagons, Italians, older Italian man, and he explicitly salutes the Roman, the sign, and state and express the words, offensive words towards my son, who had a Black Power style hairstyle. So if this is not praising fascism on one hand is a crime, on the other hand, this country is full still of expressions of this kind that invite for a reflection, profound reflection about what fascism and Nazism means. On the other hand, Liviu, when he states that in the last 5 years, in terms of the issue of Italian immigration, the public opinion is that there were more Italians than immigrants, and I agree, because there are more Italians, there are immigrants. But who is dealing with these issues? How is this issue dealt with? Does that emerge? What emerges are the titles of those who are bringing the coronavirus. And this is part of this, the titles, the headlines draw attention of common citizens, from common citizens, that foreigners are impregnating of the society with coronavirus, contaminating Italian citizens with the coronavirus, who are therefore. So this is an issue, but what are the layers of Italian society who are aware of that? So it's necessary to have a profound reflection upon that in order to find the best solution in order to debate this issue. It seems like there's a lot of debates that we still need to have with Brazilian society. There are several aspects that are not debated, and several issues that do not emerge in the public debate, and that should be debated. It is actually a taboo that has been brought forth by Cristina, although that is also in terms of the trajectory, in terms of the impact of this colonialism in Italy, it is also a problem that is still and we may not understand properly these issues of racism. Perfect. I'm going to back to some questions that have been posed here in the chat. So I am so moved by these lectures, and I would like to state how the exchanges of cultural and political, Afro-diasporic cultural and political issues have an influence in issues of anti-racist struggles in Portugal, Italy, and Brazil. And there are a number of comments by Livio. A question that is worth thinking. Is it worth thinking about racism in the peripheries and how racism of racialized racist thinking? That's the question. It seems like we are moving towards a world of racists without racists, and I think that it's a good insight in terms of thinking about actually a roundtable around this issue. And a question, I would like to thank you for your interventions. The question is, in the midst of the pandemic in the Brazilian context, we are still facing campaigns or dealing with key campaigns for raising food money. The pandemics and the decisions made by the Brazilian government have been actually presented to millions who were starving, and half of the households that have experienced some degree of food insecurity. I would like to know more about the realities of people who have been facing the challenges of the pandemics, and if there's anything that looks like what has been called in Brazil the emergence relief fund, anything towards such types of policies? It's known that distributing cure perspective conservative governments and authoritarian governments. How can we equate this need to protect racialized populations without transforming this discourse of distancing, of social distancing, as in a hypocrisy of invisibility of social conditions? Would it be a fact in terms of thinking of vaccination campaigns for different people in conditions of vulnerability? And the last question, we may open it up for a new round of questions. Congratulations, Cristina Roldão, for your reflections. Thank you for sharing. For contemporary days, we have an understanding that there is an institutional issues and that organized economic relationships naturalizing distribution of wealth and those who have no access, naturalizing those who have access to better education. However, I am concerned about the use of the term structural racism and how it's being in order to take away the responsibility of the state. And sentences are employed. It's hard to combat racism because it is structural. Well, it's hard to make racism responsible because racism is entrenched in society. So how can we not make this perverse impacts of racism banalized? Since are the impacts of the what has been said by Cristina and Patrícia, we need several different tables to address all of the layers of what has been posed. So please address these issues. Thank you for your questions. I'm not sure if I'm going to address all of them because this is a conversation. So about the issue of these campaigns, this is an issue that we may look at from several perspectives. In Portugal, for example, one of the issues that have been taking place is that if before the pandemics, the obligations of those, what stated in our constitutions and what has been transferred to the private sector and the social institutions of solidarity that live from the support of the state, as much as they are able to have a universal public policies that there's always that create the more impoverished, those who are then rights become a support that needs to be deserved, and those who deserve, all of people who talk about solidarity, they are able to have institutions of social solidarity, and therefore in Portugal, the number of people who need support, food support, because the pandemic started, the outbreak was in March, and then there was unemployment. But the things didn't hit us hard, as hard. Then we are dropping or falling rather from the economic standpoint, and we haven't seen the consequences that we know is going to be one of the biggest crises we've ever gonna have, at least in terms of Portuguese democracy. So we have these issues of the universal public services for social assistance by so the choice for food, the process of distribution and selection of people that may receive this support. And all of this then distorts the logic of rights. Then we have this issue, and I would like then to pose a problem in terms of the social movement as the pandemic comes around. Of course, we already know who are the first ones to take the brunt of the COVID. The Black impoverished population in the peripheries, there are going to be unemployed. Many of them were unemployed, but who are now going to be in worse conditions, and therefore there is this gap amongst us in terms of the question, what should we do? Of course, we need to organize ourselves in order to deal with these issues, but at the same time, as we do that, we end up entering in logics and discourses that may not be, that take away our energies in terms of doing the work that transforms us into something, in terms of choosing where can we get the support that. So it is about developing campaigns to raise food and solidarity campaigns in the Black community in neighborhoods, but there is this issue on the table. So this is and then I'm not here. It's a situation that we need to address in talking about the material conditions of people. But we need to think about what does that do in terms of our struggles. The relationships between Brazil and Portugal, I believe that I need to state that in Portugal, there is a dialogue. It might not be a dialogue that in which we state, we have conversations with several activists around the table. That's not the format, but we follow the literature, the debates that is produced in Brazil, the strategies of the rupture strategies and key concepts that are utilized in Brazil. Hence, we follow through social media and literature, and then there's so many wonderful things in terms of these senses. And we have in Portugal several students and academics that travel to Brazil in order to study issues of race. And then in 1 or 2 years, it involves them and when then contribute to these and to our reflections. And hence, this picture that Omar saw, in which I'm hugging Sueli Carneiro, it's not every day. So we were very happy, but that was one of the moments in which we have this network at universities and study centers, studies of Brazil. We are weaving this network, and I think that there is a very close relationship that also has to do with the issue of language, of course, but issues that are very similar, issues of racial democracy, loser tropicalism, and the notion of mestiçagem, of racial mixing. These are obstacles that we face and that we need to address in terms of its proximity. In 2019, we had a conference in which I had the privilege of organizing this front. So when this conference is biannual, this biennial conference and continued in inland and Nordic countries, so Afro-Europeans, then these Nordic countries, in Portugal, in 2019, there were many Black Brazilians, and since we always had, we were amongst the Black academics, we had, nobody was raising this issue because obviously the diaspora then has to do with national frontiers, and therefore you cannot wrap it up in a box. And it was very interesting to see the network and this historical bond at work. So I think we are at a moment of strengthening, but we need to continue to strengthen them. And this is what is then institutional racism. Doesn't it take away some responsibilities? I have this feeling as well, but I also know that in this struggle, this academic struggle, that doesn't mean academic knowledge is removed from political strategies, but it's also not to pretend that a capacity of reflection. What I state is that all these concepts are valid in terms of a condition, this historical moment in which it's very important to listen to particular notions and ideas. And I think that we haven't heard everything this concept of institutional racism has to offer. If I take if there's these risks, yes, we always need to think about it in immediate ways and protect it, but I do not discard the problem. It makes me think about should it be African, Black, we are not going to find the concept key. It's always a struggle. It's always circumstantial in terms of what do we bring. For example, in Brazil, I know there is a whole discussion about resignifying the word black, preto, preta. And I understand the importance of the sophistication of this political resistance, but in Portugal, the word black, preto, is utilized as an insult for Black people. Nobody states there's a difference in Portuguese between negro and preto that is usually translated as black in English. So this is what she's going into these details here. This word, then, there's no, this debate then, if there's no race and there's no color, therefore, there's only human beings. In a few days, some time from now, I may interrogate it, but I think that what we have here is a strategic thing, and not to have this notion that we are going to find the perfect concept. No, it's perfect. May I just pose a comment? This last question of structural racism has provoked me to think about an issue that is concomitantly conceptual and political. We need to think about it in terms of perhaps, because this issue, why is it posed? From the conceptual standpoint, we have a notion that the structure is against subjects, and therefore, if you have a structure, subjects disappear, a radical approach to structuralism. But we need to think about a colonial debate in which, if we were to think of an author like Eduardo Said, he states that concomitantly Orientalism is institutional, is structural, but it has subjects that are delineated and revealed in the process. There's no mention of the Orientalist figure. So if we think about this critique, this post-colonial critique, we may have this combination that makes sense to be this radical disappearance of the subject. But I think that post-colonialism has taken a good turn. Patrícia, sorry. I'm listening and I'm interested. I'm here more to learn than to speak, but I think that Cristina has already addressed several of these issues. I feel contemplated by her words and by our mediator, and I found here an interesting question, which is the issue of hunger, these anti-famish campaigns in newspapers and social media, and comparably the context in Brazil. I think that here in Italy, we may not speak of a reality such as Brazil, because first of all, the dimensions of these realities in terms of countries, and also in terms of the level of poverty present. But what I may state is that in Italy, the impoverishment of the population has been tremendous during this period, and it's been that way more and more. And when we watch this progressive impoverishment of the working class, because people have lost their jobs. And when we talk about immigrants, we need to consider that many of them don't have work that is legal. and oftentimes they work as illegal contingency positions, and therefore they don't have access, for example, of social, financial support, and that has an impact in their lives, particularly in such type of moments. And here, the question, for example, if the issue of food insecurity, taking into consideration that the Brazilian government have starved in Brazil in 2001, the country is facing a few problems. Here in Italy, there is a system that they called integrationist, which is to a social support for people when they lose their jobs. But of course, that also serves for that only serves for people who have legal work, who, in terms of social support, there's several people who may receive that. But when we talk about this universe of immigration and this reality, this integration is not everybody's. For some, a few who are a part of these categories, and therefore I believe that this social isolation is not for everybody in this country. There are social categories that have never known, and that includes immigrants, domestic workers, and those who deal with the elderly, who are immigrants, and so on and so forth. And several of these categories don't have any possibility of receiving these funds, having access to these funds. And I also need to state that from the part of the state, I remember in particular of the Conte Governo, several initiatives to attenuate the impact of the crisis in terms of governmental initiatives. But of course, this is very complicated. And as you know, vis-a-vis the reality of a crisis of yet to be known, I am not able to predict what's coming ahead in terms of in these communities. So there are several issues that are yet to be, that I am not able to address because this is an ongoing crisis. I think that everything is out in the open. Just a small comment about the emergency relief. Brazil, it has benefited at least from 20 years of a universal technology. What do I mean by that? It means that you don't need to be legal in order to have access to this emergency relief, because I worked this year with the Haitian community in Brazil, where you have a considerable number of Haitians who are not undocumented. And also we have the situation of Bolivians who are undocumented, and people coming from African countries, and they had access to this emergency support because it has benefited from a technology that was created particularly during the Workers' Party rule. We don't know what's happening. So we are coming to the closing of our morning I think that we have here another question. Good afternoon. Thank you for this debate. And this issue has to do with the dominant narrative that after the pandemics, nothing is going to be the same. However, we've seen a deepening of poverty all over the world. In terms of a strategic thinking, how has academia been thinking about the post-academic world? So if you could share one line about that. And then I don't want to think about the post-pandemic because I feel like the social sciences need to move away from this temptation of unavoidably, please. I'm not. We cannot predict where things are going. Things are still unfolding. However, there is a crescendo of violence and racism, of course. The ways of violence that have gained space. And I believe it is a sign. So what else do we need? Because if don't have these aspects, if not even has allowed us to think about a collective project in terms of its logic, more in an issue of course, the pandemic has then brought this social transformation, but it has to do with this paradigm shift. It's not that, however. I'm not going to speculate beyond that. Patricia, would you like to say anything else? Omar, I am thanking you immensely for this opportunity. It's been a pleasure to listen to you and to reflect about some issues. It's a pleasure. And to that we may not foresee the problems and what's going to happen. It's very premature for us to understand the impact of this pandemic and where is it leading us? My understanding is that actually it has allowed us to look at the perverse impacts of racism. Of course, the pandemic has led us to see the other things in terms of human in the moments of crisis is that when we start to get to know people and we also get to know society. So the pandemic is evincing this, it's been a school of life for us. And that's it. And thank you. In terms of vaccination, Cristina has said something that is fundamental because one of the groups there are against breaking patents. They state that it would research about vaccinations, supposing that these are big corporations, private corporations. This is a fallacy. We know that these conglomerates benefit tremendously from public resources. The resources that go to vaccinations are public resources. We know that in the Brazilian context, for example, everything that has to do with the possibility of vaccines being utilized here are funding coming from governmental funds as much as it is the case in the United States. The center of the neoliberal universe, those who fund research are fundamentally public resources, and this is then another fallacy that they want to impose upon us, as though breaking patents would empty research. We have when Brazil was a decent country, we championed the breaking of patents for retroviral medicine, which deepened the research on the consequences of HIV/AIDS. I think that what you're stating makes a lot of sense, because in terms of the patents and the vaccines, we refer to a world that is even more divided between the haves and the have-nots, those who have resources, those who can't have access to resources. So instead of being a moment of redimensioning relationships and stitching historical problems of the past that we have, the crisis is still in terms of revealing division, cleavages. I would like to state that I feel very privileged to be in charge of this table. I would like to thank you all for supporting it. I would like to thank Raquel, who works as a translation in sensible ways, and I would like to inform Cristina Roldão that she's been captured for the Ideias. If you're once in the Fabrica, you're always going to be in the Fabrica, which means that you are not only going to participate in this table, you're going to be an accomplice in our work. So, and I state that with great joy. I would like to thank Patrícia and thank Cristina, who I knew was going to provide us with priceless contributions. Thank you so much. We could stay here for a long time. Please invite me always for this event. No question about that. And we wanted to be in presence so that our next version is going to be in your city, Salvador da Bahia. So you don't have any doubts that the conditions will allow us to work with our factory of ideas in Salvador, Bahia. Thank you. Thank you, Patrícia. Thank you for the opportunity of reconnecting and talking about these complex but very important issues. Thank you for this debate, for the reflections, for the opportunities of reading and understanding the issues of race and in Portugal, and issues of the immigrants and the Portuguese, first and second, third citizens, and issues that we need to reflect upon. I would like to thank Omar and to state that we have this theme about which we still need to reflect because it's ongoing, but it allows us to finally think about the racial debate to the center of attentions. In Portugal, in the Brazilian reality, but also the Italian reality, and establishing a dialogue among these continents. I think it's been very important. And also, we need to remind you that on our lectures, perhaps, will be transcribed for of ideas, and perhaps the text is possibly going to be sent. Thank you so much for the opportunity of being here in this table. It's a privilege, and I would like to say that we have raised a good debate, which is important in the sense. Before we wrap up, I would like to remind you that on Tuesday, 11th, we are going to have another session. The theme will be the use of facts in infodemia, in pandemics, COVID-19 in Brazil. We are going to have Charbel Elani from Bahia, Federal University of Bahia, Fernando Bacholo from Burkina Faso, and the mediator is going to be Kyu Kim from the University of Korea. So we count on your presence on Tuesday 11th, our next session of the Fabrica. Lívio is here explaining that in terms of the contributions, Cristina and Patrícia, they are going to be transcribed and to send the text. Thank you. Thank you so much. Before I forget, down with Bolsonaro. Down with fascism. See you on Tuesday. Bye.